Video gaming, like all forms of media, is a social experience. It always has been. Before the time when home consoles were even popular, arcades existed and were a hotspot for people back in the late 70s and throughout the 90s. After school and on the weekends, kids would hang out at arcades for hours and play games with their friends. Arcade games at the time didn't really have the complexity to require guides to play. Most machines had the controls and instructions printed on them, so players could hop into a game and figure out easily their first time playing. Back in the arcade era of gaming, new strategies for games didn't really come up often, and were really just spread through word of mouth, if and when they did. Games on arcade machines were simple enough to not really require in-depth strategies or walkthroughs. Guides didn't exist because they didn't need to. Simply word of mouth was enough. As time went on, technology evolved and gaming adapted. Over time, games that came out were less arcadey in the complexity sense. Starting a game wasn't just something you did when you had a minute to spare. It became something that required a bit more input and time investment. Controls to these games weren't just 2 to 4 buttons and a joystick, but slowly became more and more buttons and eventually 2 joysticks. Not just this, but as games became more complex, they also got longer. Once gaming became a little more mainstream with home consoles and gaming systems, game developers started to realize simple and short arcade-esque experiences would not hold the industry together forever. Games needed to be a more sustained form of entertainment, and thus games became a bit longer and more complex. With video games still being a new thing in the mainstream, on top of their newfound complexity, some gamers would be confused. To avoid further confusion, everybody adapted. Players adapted by creating game communities or just talking about new games with their friend groups. Lunch tables in schools were a common way of finding friends who liked similar games. Sharing an experience with friends and even playing games face to face with them definitely helped players progress through games, whether using direct help or plain old inspiration. Developers adapted and started making tutorial segments of games in order to keep newer gamers playing by explaining controls, in-game systems, and techniques. During load screens, hints would pop up and players would have enough time to read them. Environments wouldn't load within seconds, and players had ample time to read tips, especially useful ones like when you hit 0 health points, you die. Publishers adapted and made commercials to market their product to new audiences. In most commercials, gameplay was shown to sort of give players a small taste of the game. If the game looked simple or palatable enough, the commercial would do its job advertising the game and heighten the new player experience. There were also demo discs, which I barely remember, but they were cool ways of trying new games without having to financially commit to buying them. Publishers also created supplemental materials in form of written game guides and books. These guidebooks weren't required by any means to play the game, but would be helpful to newer players and players who would want to know everything about the game. If you had a guidebook, it would be hard to miss out on any systems in a game, as you could always just refer back to the book. Guidebooks and the like were big when I was in elementary school, and so was the Scholastic Book Fair. I remember every year being excited for a book fair, although I hated books in school. Just picking up a guidebook, a cheat code book, or even a world record book for gaming got me excited. Plus, all of those knickknacks sold at the fair were cool, even if they were completely pointless. The thing about this era of gaming was that guides weren't required to a large extent. Games weren't too complicated, and no game really needed a wiki. Some games were more in-depth for sure, but none needed supplemental material. Gamers might get stuck in a game or could want to learn more, and that's where guidebooks came in. Games that had more depth enabled these guides to exist. However, these games didn't require gamers to know everything. There also wasn't a heavy demand from players to have access to all information of a game at a moment's notice. The gaming community was a lot more okay with learning things on their own or with uncommon resources. All these factors save guidebooks are still in place today, but there's so much more going on in terms of making games more guided and accessible, especially for free online. This is not to say it's problematic, it just comes with a small but underlying downside. I can't pinpoint a specific year where this happened, despite it happening so quickly, but gaming had changed from being a semi-niche experience to being such a common hobby. It's great to see my hobby that I've had since I was a kid explode in popularity and become something not too nerdy or looked down upon. However, with this explosion comes some aftermath. Gaming has changed socially. It's now so much more of a social experience, even if it is an experience mostly through the internet. Having a completely individual and personal experience with a game in this era is rare to have. Everything from trailers, social media advertisements, and discussions, to reviews, store pages for a game, forums, general hype, and all that impacts someone's experience on a game. The impact of these things vary, of course. Reading a review is more prone to spoil and influence opinions on a game than just looking at a store page, but both have their impacts. For instance, some games can be spoiled just from their genre tags, particularly anything with the psychological horror tag. Asking your friend to play one of these games and telling them not to look up anything for the game potentially ruins the surprises that may come from it due to expectations for a twist. Since gaming can be a social experience, avoiding spoilers in gaming communities can be fairly difficult. Most people won't actively try and spoil things, but looking at posts or in replies, you may see someone more casually reference something that you weren't ready to know about. This can even come into play while being part of these communities before a game even fully releases. Communities are likely to discuss trailers or advertisements which could lead to affecting one's experience unknowingly, while also risking being spoiled. Trailers can spoil story beats, gameplay elements, characters, and if the title is a sequel, it can spoil some outcomes of previous iterations. For a minor example, having a grapple hook in a game can influence players to buy the game, so obviously it'll be put into trailers for marketing, even if the grapple hook is unlocked later in the game. Trailers, even outside of the gaming sphere, are also prone to spoil elements about the content of the media, and nothing is exempt. Movie trailers influence who sees the movie, but often trailers spoil a decent portion of action in movies. Experiencing media with one's own opinion and without expectations is something that this era doesn't really enable, simply due to how fast information travels and how accessible it is. But why does this matter, and why should anyone care about this? Gaming provides a unique experience to everyone. No one person should feel the exact same as someone else about every game. Honestly, this should apply to anything in life as well, but I'm not here to preach about life in this video. I'm just here to talk about gaming. Games should be able to provide an experience that people can relate to on their own before outside sources influence their opinions too much. I know this isn't really on the topic of guideless gaming, but I still think it's important to at least think about. Have you ever played a game that everyone seems to recommend against, but you enjoyed it? Or, more likely, have you ever played a game that you disliked that everyone else praised? For the most part, one can and should be encouraged to try things that they want to try and experience things for themselves without external influences. Experiencing any form of media raw and without external influence might enhance the consumer experience. Over the past few years, I've been trying to experience most movies and games like this. Now, don't laugh at me because this is gonna sound dumb, but I knew nothing about Jordan Peele's Nope when I originally saw it, and honestly that enhanced the experience of it. I didn't even know what subgenre of horror it was. I only knew its name and director. In the part of the movie where the horse named Ghost disappears and you see a movement in the sky, I genuinely thought that the horse turned into a ghost or something and started flying around the ranch. I know it's dumb, but honestly, in some way that improved my watching experience. I don't know how or why, but not finding out about the true direction of the movie until a decent portion through intrigued me more than just outright knowing. Bringing this back to gaming, I've been able to experience most games without supplemental material with relative ease in the past few years. There's definitely a point in which I will either cave and look up things on the internet for help or just to understand systems better. But I usually find myself able to wait until after I beat the game once. This is great for two reasons. First off, this enhances the discovery experience of games. From games as simple as Vampire Survivors to more complicated like the original Resident Evil, I felt more inclined to play and discover just because I wasn't using external information much or at all. Secondly, experiencing games without external influence can increase playtime and money value from the game. Say if you beat a game once and following its completion, you look up some sort of guide or tips and tricks or anything really. When replaying the game, you'll have a different and more comfortable experience where you can try out the things that you've learned. Doing this also increases playtime of games that you might have only ever played once. Guideless gaming is in a weird spot right now. In this era of gaming, it can be hard to find some games where guideless gaming is considered by the developers or even really rewarding. Some games now seem like they require a wiki for some systems or are too complex to be tutorialized well. As some systems in gaming get more complicated, communities of these games will create guides rather than the developers. Even some games may avoid signposting or guide posting as much as possible to enhance the guideless experience. But communities create guides to make the game more accessible, which, to clarify, is not an issue. Guides are optional, but their existence and commonality can affect the unique player experience. The accessibility of guides, coupled with the complexity of some games, over-incentivizes guides while somewhat de-incentivizing playing without them. I'd like to give some examples of how guideless gaming may impact some games. Feel free to skip through this section whenever you want, because it's a fairly long string of examples. Call of Duty Zombies is one of my favorite side modes in any video game. One thing that I've always found enjoyable in Zombies is the mode's many Easter eggs. Finishing an Easter egg quest in Zombies is a rewarding experience, but rarely people will discover a map's Easter egg without looking up at least a hint online. At least, that's what it seemed like after Black Ops 3. For example, there's a step on Zatsubo no Shima that requires players to water a plant for 3 consecutive rounds to get an artillery shell that they need to shoot at the right time to take down a plane. And that's just one step. If you wanted to figure out Easter egg quests in Zombies without guides and you were playing on Xbox or PC, you would have to avoid spoilers and guides for a whole month before the map even released on your system. Action roguelikes like Binding of Isaac and Enter the Gungeon don't always clearly establish what items do, so communities detail effects and synergies in wikis and mods. The 2 highest downloaded mods for Binding of Isaac are informational mods and are a requirement for a lot of players to actually enjoy the game, especially when some items have notable downsides like Bob's brain or Isaac's heart. People who have played the game a bit more know that these items are bad, but newer players will just pick these up willy-nilly and lose their run because of it. These mods can help minimize this and make the new player experience a little bit better. Minecraft, and more so Terraria, are complicated games even without mods. Both have a form of tutorial helping players get through the basics of the game, but to gain a more in-depth understanding of these games with every update, external sources are essential. There's even mods that complicate the game more. These just add more to the external resource requirement, but these mods and their complexity are up to the player's discretion to run. Final Fantasy XII has a system that is briefly explained in the game. This system is called a bazaar, and in short, selling loot that you get from enemies can get you packages from the store. For example, selling 2 wolf pelts and 1 earthstone will unlock some armor. Without a guide, you may miss this system entirely, and most, if not all, recipes. With a guide, you may have access to the best weapons in the game and know a way to take advantage of the system to chain several unlocks while spending far less loot than required. If this sounds confusing, it is, and I will not elaborate any further because I don't even know all the specifics of this system, and I have more examples to get through. Rain World is a game that rarely guideposts anything, and is a difficult game even without the lack of signposting. The environment of Rain World is always adapting and ready to punish players who have yet to figure out the systems properly. Community guides for this game on Steam acknowledge this, and some writers spoil warning their guide and explain that finding out the game is part of the experience. I recently finished Alien Isolation, and not knowing much about the AI to begin with did cause some extra deaths by arbitrarily increasing the difficulty, but it also let me learn more about the aliens' behavior by myself. The lack of knowledge that I had to begin with of the aliens' pathing enhanced the survival horror experience. When I played the HD remaster of Resident Evil for the first time, I didn't know where to go and was forced to figure out everything by myself, the way the game was intended when it originally came out. Unfortunately, I missed a key item in one room and was unable to figure out what it was. After well over an hour of troubleshooting and backtracking throughout the mansion, through several long door animations, I finally caved and tried to look up what I missed, all while trying to avoid looking too far into a guide to avoid any other outside influence. Avoiding the minefield was a success, and I realized that I had interacted with the key item earlier. When I did it, my inventory was full, and I thought of it as useless, so I moved on. It was a stupid mistake that punished me with a ton of lost time. Using a guide saved me more pain than playing guideless would have caused. When I played through Sekiro, I encountered an enemy that seemed barely beatable. I couldn't do much damage, it would inflict me with a status effect that would kill me, and I could only really kill it by filling its stagger bar. Little did I know, just using a consumable item would have made this combat a walk in the park. After a few deaths against this enemy and his immobile health bar, I paced the fight enough and parried enough hits to not die from the status and kill the enemy by filling its stagger bar. If I had just used a guide or knew to use the consumable, the combat would not been as rewarding or engaging, but way less stressful. From Software games become a lot easier to get through when you have a build guide. One of my friends isn't the best at Souls-like games, but he enjoys the atmosphere and lore. So to help him get through fights, bosses, and the game in general, he uses build guides on YouTube. He says without build guides, he wouldn't really be able to have a chance to experience the game. Personally, I wouldn't look up a build until I beat the game, but I don't blame him for getting the help that he can. After all, he bought the game and he should be able to experience it. I'm finally at my last example, a more overarching and, to be fair, an arbitrary one. Multiplayer PvP games, especially competitive ones, have metas, and that's no secret to any of us. When someone finds a new multiplayer game that they want to get invested in, they may look up guides for it. Depending on the complexity of a title, systems in the game, how its community treats new players, and how often it gets updates, multiplayer games can be punishing for guideless gamers. The learning curve for games like Smite, Overwatch, and League of Legends grows with each new update. Earlier on in these games' life cycles, there was less to learn, but as more updates and characters roll out, the harder these games are to learn. Tutorials in these games aren't super great either. Metas are constantly changing, and developers don't have the time or energy to tutorialize metas, or even seasonal updates. Playing these games somewhat requires someone to teach you in some way, or a lot of players will think you're actively throwing just because you don't know how to play in the current meta or against certain characters. Gaming completely guideless is hard, and I'm not just saying that in a sense where the games themselves are difficult. Sure, they can be, but what I'm really getting at is the act of being a gamer without using any external resource is nearly impossible, and where it is possible can be risky. Buying games blindly is not the correct way to buy and play games. Going back to my story of seeing the Nope movie, I knew that Nope was going to probably be a horror movie. I knew what Jordan Peele produced, and I'm a fan of his work. I knew that my experience at the movies would be worth it, and if it wasn't, at least I experienced it with friends. However, jumping into a game blindly doesn't always go the best way. Sure, Steam offers refunds, but some games take longer than 2 hours to get fully invested into. This nullifies the automatic Steam refund policy and can force someone to have to pay for and keep a game that they don't really want. Apart from Steam, games aren't always able to be refunded. So jumping into a game without knowing anything about it, including how well it performs, is not a smart decision, especially when so many AAA games aren't received well today. Reviews are important, and are usually worth the small risk of spoiling minor story or gameplay elements. Even so-called spoiler-less reviews can still spoil gameplay elements. Depending on what you consider a spoiler, any feature that might come later in a game can be spoiled easily in a review, and this is fairly common. Depending on how serious you consider extremely minor spoilers, this can be an issue, especially when wanting to experience the game completely individually, and even to a point where basic elements seen in trailers may come as a surprise. Listening to reviews and reception of a game may also lessen someone's enjoyment of a game, or may even dissuade them from ever playing it, which may be a problem if they would have enjoyed the game despite its common sentiment. Here's a hypothetical. You see a game announced and want to play it before reading reviews, or hey, even without giving people's reviews a chance to come out. The only thing you may have seen may be a trailer or even just a promotional image of a new game in a series or by a developer. So to experience as much of this game yourself without any external influence, you pre-order it. You haven't played the game, you haven't heard much about the game, it just looked interesting at the moment and you bought it. Cool, you have almost no external influence on your experience with this game. This is obviously a huge gamble, and is uncommon for gamers to do this often now. No Man's Sky and Cyberpunk 2077 were super hyped, and a ton of people pre-ordered those games without waiting for reviews or opinions to come out. Obviously, these games had their redemption after a ton of extra development. But they also did a lot of work to dissuade gamers from pre-ordering things and doing the research before buying into games too early. If you want to avoid spoilers and make your own opinions with games, it can be hard to avoid coming into a mediocre experience that doesn't match the money spent on it. Being too hyped for a game and the game flopping is what replaced hype with some caution. Caution can be good to help save money and time, but as I've said, it can also spoil some games. Being hyped about a game and reading about it before it releases can also spoil things. This goes anywhere from minor spoilers to heavy story spoilers. You need to tread cautiously online if you want to avoid spoilers. I mean, that's obvious. But honestly, it can be worth the risk if you don't want to add a game that you dislike to your library. It's such an unfortunate push and pull that we either have to risk buying a game that we might not like, or risk getting spoiled on story or gameplay elements, while also not being able to 100% authentically experience the game due to seeing others' opinions and subconsciously adapting them to our own. Guideless gaming is in a weird state, and has been for a while. No one can fully experience a game completely independently, at least without some risk of purchasing a game that isn't good, or at least one that they don't like. It's fairly uncommon to just see a game that you want without hearing anything about it beforehand. Gaming was built off of unique experiences, and that building block seems to be fading from importance. Don't get me wrong, it's still there, but it's not considered by developers and communities. Experiences in gaming, when supported by communities, can feel less personal and unique. Looking at discussions and talking to gaming communities before finishing a game can not only change your perspective of a game, but can also potentially spoil some elements. Don't get me wrong, the ability for games and experiences to be shared around the world is great, and it's something that should not go away. Gaming communities can make gaming experiences better and can even change lives. People have met best friends online due to gaming, and there's no shame in that. But sometimes gaming communities can be a bit much. Gaming can be too much of a social experience and can drastically change one's own opinion. Completely independent experiences in gaming have become less commonplace, but they still exist. And honestly, if you relate to anything said in this video, try and play through your next game without looking at any external resources and community discussions before even buying the game, if you can help it. That being said, if you like this video, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. If you think any of your friends should hear anything in this video, or you just want to support me more, share this video with them. I hope you have a great day, night, or whatever time of day it is for you, and I'll see you next time.